Lawrence H. White is a professor of economics at George Mason University and a distinguished senior fellow at the F.A. Hayek program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Mercatus Center. He received his A.B. from Harvard and his M.A. and Ph.D. from the University of California, Los Angeles. He is a contributing editor to the Foundation for Economic Education's magazine, The Freeman, and he lectures at the Foundation's annual seminar in advanced Austrian economics. In 2008, he received the Distinguished Scholar Award of the Association for Private Enterprise Education. His research has appeared in the American Economic Review, the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking, and other leading economics journals. Dr. White is the author of numerous books, including The Theory of Monetary Institutions, Renewing the Search for a Monetary Constitution, and The Clash of Economic Ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lawrence White.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's an honor to speak as part of this program. So most of my research has been in monetary economics, but I did write a book called The Clash of Economic Ideas, which has a chapter on the road to serfdom, so I guess that's how I qualified for this series. Hayek's Road to Serfdom was such a success that it actually spawned a comic book version, which is where the first slide comes from. And there is a downside to having a comic version of your book made, which is some of your opponents may only read the comic book version and get a very simplified version of the argument, but it's actually a very subtle argument. And a sophisticated argument, and an important enough argument that it made National Review's list of 100 best nonfiction books of the century. In at number 4, between Orwell and Orwell, beat out Hayek's own Constitution of Liberty, which was famously the book that Margaret Thatcher slammed on the table and explained to her ministers, "This is what we believe." I guess she said it more loudly than that, and above Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. But these 3 books, Road to Serfdom, Constitution of Liberty, and Capitalism and Freedom, are not really economics books. They're by economists, but they're books in public policy or political philosophy. And that's what distinguishes Road to Serfdom within the greater scope of Hayek's career. It kind of marks a point at which he turned from doing pure economics to thinking about broader issues, and Constitution of Liberty was one of the later results of that. So Road to Serfdom was published in 1944, Constitution of Liberty in 1960. Up to 1941, Hayek was pretty much a technical economist, and he famously, if you've seen the rap video, you know it's famous, debated with John Maynard Keynes about business cycle theory. And that was an argument conducted at a very high level, not meant for public consumption, but for professional economists. And along with Ludwig von Mises, participated, as you heard this afternoon, participated in the socialist calculation debate, where again they were talking to other economists and trying to convince them that they had a rather impoverished view of the market if they thought it could be replaced by some central bureau with a computer. But both of these were economics debates, not so much about the theory, not so much about the practical application of the public policy. But in the Road to Serfdom, in the middle of World War II, Hayek decided it was important to say something about the bigger issues facing society, and wrote about the political power dynamics, is the way I put it, of central planning. So not just the pure economic theory of it, which he'd previously talked about, but what happens when you actually try to apply central planning to an economy? What happens in the political arena? What does it imply about the kind of power the government has to concentrate and how it will end up using that power? And so here he's not talking to just his fellow economists, but he's talking to educated laymen and policymakers and the general public. It was originally written just for a British audience, but it was quickly published in an American edition. I'll come back to the book, but let me set the stage historically of the time in which Hayek was writing, because central planning ideas, socialist ideas, fascist ideas, socialisms of different kinds were very popular through the 1930s into the 1940s. In the United States, we have Franklin Roosevelt at his inaugural in 1933, and this is about the most remarkable. There are many remarkable statements in the middle of this inaugural, but he's describing the Great Depression, and he says, "Plenty is at our doorstep. But a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of the supply." So the idea was there was lots of goods being produced, but somehow the market stumbled in delivering them, and that's how we got the Great Depression. Where did he get that idea? He got it from one of his brain trusters named Rexford Tugwell. Rexford Tugwell is a name that Ayn Rand might have invented, but it was his actual name. And the ideas in Roosevelt's speech came from primarily from Tugwell and some of his other colleagues at Columbia University who made up FDR's brain trust. And in an article in an economics journal a year earlier, Tugwell had spelled out his version of what happened in the crash. The vast expansion of production during the 1920s had sort of overwhelmed markets, swamped mechanisms of an artificially limited commerce, ended in a period of violent reconstruction. And then he poses the question, what should we do about this? Shall we be unready again for the flood of still cheaper goods? So what he's suggesting is the market can't handle it. Oh no, the market can't handle technological improvements that make goods cheaper. Government has to do it. And how is government supposed to manage the flood of cheap goods? Well, Tugwell had two sources of inspiration for practical models of where he thought this was being done. One was the Soviet Union. In the 1920s, he visited the Soviet Union and came back and wrote glowing reports about how scientifically things were managed there. And the other was Mussolini's Italy. So in his diary, in 1934, he goes to Rome. He's a member of Roosevelt's administration. He's an undersecretary in the Department of Agriculture. He goes to Italy to talk to Mussolini. And this is an actual picture of the Mussolini's lobby where Tugwell was waiting. And he writes in his diary the night before he goes to meet Mussolini that Mussolini's regime is doing many of the things which seem to me necessary. And he doesn't mean wearing brown shirts and rounding people up. He means planning the economy from the center. The cleanest, neatest, most efficiently operating piece of social machinery I've ever seen. It makes me envious. It was possible for members of the American left to say that about Mussolini, and they did say it up until the time Mussolini invaded Abyssinia. And after that, it became not something you should admit that you ever admired Mussolini. But that was one of the ideas that was inspiring Tugwell. So Tugwell when he became a member of the Roosevelt administration, he was important in writing the legislation, the first New Deal legislation that came out. But here's the theory that's inspiring it. Goods will flood into markets and overwhelm them if we don't plan to make sure we're not overwhelmed with cheap goods. So how do you do that? Well, like Mussolini did, you set up industrial cartels. You set up partnerships between the government, big business, and labor unions, with government the senior partner, of course. You get them around a table, and you decide how many units should be produced, because you don't want too many, that would flood the market. And you decide then what shares of the output go to each firm, how many workers should be employed by each firm, what wages should be paid, so then you have a fight over how high the wages are. The technical name for that was corporatism, but it was the economic side of Italian fascism. And this is an inspiration to the New Deal. And Tugwell doing a lot of the writing of the legislation, we get the National Industrial Recovery Act, which creates the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. And what the NRA does is group firms and labor unions and government into industrial cartels, and it writes codes for different industries. So here's the sticker from the construction industry. And what does the code do? It says how many units are going to be produced, who's going to produce them, how many workers you're going to need, what wages you're going to pay, and so on. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA, does the same thing for agriculture. So here's one of their posters. Too much cotton, problem. Now, from the point of view of consumers, of course, this is crazy. Too much cotton is not a problem. That makes cheap cotton. That's great for consumers. Reduce crop now to prevent trouble later. And if you just step back, you can see the whole theory is crazy. You can increase profits in one industry, like agriculture, by cutting back output and getting monopoly prices. Then you can get a bigger share of the pie from the rest of the economy. But if every industry is cutting back output, there's going to be less pie. There can't possibly be prosperity. Each industry is cutting back output. They're not going to invest. They're not going to hire more workers. They're going to hire fewer workers and fewer machines. And it cannot possibly grow the economy, as the expression has it these days. And after a couple of years of the National Recovery Administration, it became clear that it was not helping the economy recover. It was the National Anti-Recovery Administration. And when the Supreme Court finally struck it down, the Roosevelt administration said, let's try something else. And so we were very fortunate in the US to have this division of powers where the Supreme Court stepped in and said, this is an unconstitutional delegation of power. I'm not sure they do that anymore, but at least 1935 they did. Well, let's go to Europe now and see what's happening in Europe. And the story I like to tell is of the economist Wilhelm Röpke, who was teaching at the University of Marburg in 1933. I just saw a film yesterday about Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher. And in this film, the story is told about a philosopher named Edmund Husserl, who also taught at the same university. And in the same year, Husserl was kicked out of his job in the philosophy department for being a Jew. Röpke was not a Jew, he was a Roman Catholic. Röpke lost his job at the University of Marburg because he was giving speeches denouncing the economic ideas of the Nazis, saying they were crazy. And so even after he lost his job, he was still living in Marburg and still giving speeches until one day he's visited, this is the picture, by two SS officers who explained to him that he really should not be criticizing the economic policies of the new government. Right? Hitler came to power in '32. But rather, he should be defending and promoting the economic policies. And Röpke writes in his memoirs that I got so angry with these guys. He describes one of them very charmingly as a thorough bruiser type. That was the translation anyway. He gets so angry with these two SS agents that he says, I angrily denounced them, I told them to get out, and I pushed them out the door and locked the door behind them. And then I paused and thought to myself, yeah, I really need to leave the country now, don't I? And he did. He moved to Istanbul. That was the best job he could get. And from Istanbul, he tried to puzzle out what had happened to the German economy. He tried to understand the fascist philosophy, and he used the term fascism not just to apply to Italy, but also to apply to the policy that the Nazis were carrying out in Germany. And this is the way he describes it. He says there really isn't any intellectual framework for this. They're just making it up as they go along. In fact, they have a minimum of intellectual freight and they're proud of it. So what do they want? They're anti-capitalist. And this becomes an important point in the road to serfdom, as I'll mention in a minute. But they want to maintain the appearances of the economy as it used to be. So nothing revolutionary. So what you get is piecemeal interventions into the economy, but with a kind of collectivist phraseology. It is the Nazi, of course, is short for National Socialist, and they really are socialists of a vague sort. And they're not Marxists, but they're who are international socialists, but they're national socialists. So, and they have this military aspect. He says it's a military anti-capitalism that corresponds to illiberalism. Of course, in his day, liberalism meant free markets, rights of the people, free trade. So this is what he writes from Istanbul, trying to figure out what are the ideas that these people have. Another German economist who managed to stay in Germany during the war, Walter Eucken, writes a piece after the war explaining how, despite the lack of this a central planning ideology to begin with, Nazi Germany became a thoroughly centrally planned economy. He says, well, they started out with make-work programs. To pay for them, the government printed a lot of money. Prices started to rise, but everybody remembered the German hyperinflation, so can't let prices rise. How do you stop that? Could stop the printing presses? No, but then we can't pay for our programs. Let's put on price controls. All right, this is, as other people have said, this is like the theory that you can keep the water from boiling you by breaking the thermometer. So we impose a general price freeze, but then the price system stops working to allocate goods. There are shortages of everything that is underpriced. So what do? You impose rationing. Firms don't want to produce as much if they can't cover their costs, so you give them orders. You allocate raw materials to different firms. So this is the process that Eucken describes, by which step by step, because people are trying to get around the early restrictions, then they're not providing enough resources to the industries that are designated. Everything ends up getting controlled. And of course, when the Nazis decide to rearm, they've got the machinery in place. They can just direct that the electricity, the steel, the rubber goes into the military factories. So they even began to distribute labor supplies, which is a polite way of saying they told people where they had to work. So there's direct allocation of labor. And of course, consumer goods. So they stopped the production of consumer goods in order to dedicate more output to, war material. So a central planning system arises in this kind of piecemeal, unplanned fashion, but they never stop and say, we're getting poorer, why don't we go? Well, once they did, actually. The first economic minister under Hitler was Helmut Schacht. And Schacht said to Hitler, this is not working, it's making our economy shrink. He got fired. They put in place Goering, who would institute 5-year plans. He called them 5-year plans. Okay, let's switch to the United Kingdom. Well, similar ideas in the United Kingdom, but here it's a definite, in part Soviet-inspired idea of central economic planning, and it comes from a group called the Fabian Society. Now, the Fabian Society had been around since the 1890s, and its most famous spokesmen were Beatrice and Sidney Webb, and the playwright, George Bernard Shaw. Shaw is, of course, a lot more famous for the plays he wrote, but if you actually count the number of words he wrote as a pamphleteer for the Fabian Society, it outnumbers the number of words in his plays. He's a lot taller than the Webbs, too, I should mention that. So from the 1890s, they're publishing lots and lots of pamphlets. The picture of the book I have here is sort of the first big collection of Fabian essays that was a bestseller, made a splash. But that's back around 1900. In the early 20th century, so the kind of things they're proposing are minimum wages, maximum work hours, nationalization of railroads, nationalization of the coal industry, nationalization of the healthcare industry. And a lot of these policies get adopted eventually. But the word Fabian comes from the Roman general, Fabius Maximus, Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose strategy was delay, delay, delay. Well, they're not trying to delay, but they'll take whatever they can get in the legislature. They don't think a revolution is necessary to bring about socialism. Just get what you can opportunistically and grow and grow and grow the role of the government in the economy. Sidney and Beatrice Webb go to the Soviet Union. I should also mention they're very important in the Labor Party. of the three major British parties at that time. Sidney Webb, in fact, at one point is General Secretary of the party and writes the party's constitution. The Webbs go to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and of course, they're shown around by the Soviet government and shown all the wonderful things that are going on. They see all the Potemkin villages, and they come back and write a book about all the wonderful things that are going on in the Soviet Union. And they call it, in the first edition, it's Soviet Communism, a New Civilization, ? In the second edition, 1937, they drop the question mark. They are convinced that this is a new civilization. And John Maynard Keynes, who's not in the Labor Party even, he's in the Liberal Party. It's the remnant of the classical liberal thinking in Great Britain. And Keynes still believes in free trade, but not much else from the liberal agenda. And he reviews the Webb's book on the BBC radio, and this is what he says. The result is impressive. They're making a whole new set of institutions work smoothly and successfully. It's an enthralling work. And then he goes on to say, I wish we could adopt this willingness to experiment in the UK, while of course retaining our old-fashioned conservatism. Oh, he hadn't quite decided, but so Keynes is on board, and he's supposed to represent he considers himself a member of the classical liberal party. There's, of course, a third party, which are the conservatives, but the conservatives have gotten rather wet, as Thatcher used to say, or as Harold Macmillan's nanny put it after she read the book, Mr. Harold is a dangerous pink. So Harold Macmillan, the Conservative Party MP at this point, but later the Prime Minister, so he's considered an up-and-comer at this time, writes a book called The Middle Way. So he's not defending conserving the traditional institutions. He's saying, well, we have to be somewhere halfway between that and what the communists are proposing. So let's just nationalize a few industries, and let's just disable markets in a few places, and let's create some industrial cartels the way they did in the United States, and so on. And that's the middle way. So the center of economic policy thinking is very favorable to central planning when the Labor Party takes power after the war. During the war, of course, there's de facto, pragmatic, get the job done central planning of the war industries, at least, in both Great Britain and in the United States. And in the United States, it's run by the War Production Board. There's a similar board called the Ministry of Production, and then later the Ministry of War Production in Great Britain. And in both economies, consumer goods output is restricted in order to turn factories over to war production. And in order to share, what the Labor Party called it was fair shares, in order to allow consumers equal shares of the very restricted output of consumer goods, rationing is implemented rather than let prices rise to clear the markets. Because at high prices, there would be profiteering. Well, you could prevent the profits by allowing firms to compete to provide the high-priced consumer goods, and that would bring the prices down, but we can't do that because we're directing them to produce war materials. So, rationing in both economies. And when the Labor Party sees this, they say, this is great, this is what we've been arguing for all along. Now all we have to do is convince the public, the voters, to retain this system when we come out of the war. Right? So now we're getting close to the date at which Hayek publishes The Road to Serfdom. And in 1942, the Labor Party issues a pamphlet saying this very explicitly. We have to replace competition with a planned society. We have to keep the wartime controls. So keep price controls on consumer goods, keep price controls on major industrial products, keep price controls on coal, on steel, on electricity. And then, of course, markets don't allocate those things, so we, the government, will have to decide what the priorities are. And, you know, who can be against planning? Right? Any rational person believes in planning. So we're going to have one big plan. And as Hayek later pointed out in Road to Serfdom, the question is not who's in favor of planning and who's against it. The question is who plans for whom? Do people get to plan for themselves, or is there one plan that everybody has to go along with? But so this is the climate of opinion that Hayek is facing. The road to serfdom emerges out of Hayek's attempts to explain to his fellow academics and journalists and other intellectuals what's going on here. What is the nature of this planning that people are talking about? So the first sort of inkling of it comes in 1933. Hayek taught at the London School of Economics. The London School of Economics was actually founded by the Fabian Society, by Sidney and Beatrice Webb and their donors. And the idea was to promote their ideas, but they believed in free discourse, so they didn't control the hiring, and the LSE hired Hayek and Lionel Robbins and some other classical liberals. But the economics department was run by a Fabian named Beveridge, William Beveridge, and Beveridge had given a speech talking about how what's happened in Germany is an attempt to defend the last vestiges of free market capitalism. The Nazis are defenders of free market capitalism. And Hayek says, no, Hayek writes him a memo to explain to him just how wrong he is. Says, no, look, it's socialism, National Socialism. It's a genuine socialist movement. And he says, look, people have been pushing anti-market policies in Germany for a long time, going back to the Bismarck era, going back to the group that was mentioned this afternoon, the German Historical School of Economists, who were all, at the time they were called the socialists of the chair. They were tenured professors who were rooting for the policy of Bismarck, which was not a Marxian socialism, but a kind of conservative socialism where there's a bigger safety net, government involvement in basic industries, that sort of thing. And Hayek says, okay, they're not Marxists, so they may let small shopkeepers keep their small shops. Or the way he puts it is, it's not a proletarian socialism, it's a middle-class socialism. But that doesn't change the fact that the government's going to demand control over all the commanding heights of the economy, over the banking system to decide who gets investment funds, over the allocation of raw materials, even over the allocation of labor, as happened. So this memo to Beveridge evolves into Chapter 12 of The Road to Serfdom. And there's another impetus that Hayek is working from, and that is, he explains this in a letter to Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann had written sort of the first important book in a long time, challenging the whole centralization and central planning, socialization ideas that were so popular in his book, The Good Society. So Hayek writes to Lippmann and says, I wish I could make my progressive friends. The term progressive goes back to the 19th century. It's been rediscovered by those who no longer want to call themselves liberals. But the term itself goes back a long way. I wish I could make them understand that democracy is possible only under capitalism. So Hayek's trying to defend the political institutions that give ordinary citizens a vote over important things. And that's important to recognize because some of his critics accused him of having anti-democratic ideas. And that collectivist experiments lead inevitably to fascism of one sort or the other. So the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and Japan were all doing similar sorts of things, similar sorts of central planning systems, one way or another. They all have this in common. So in the book, Hayek seems to spend more time attacking the example of Germany than he does the Soviet Union, but partly that was because in 1944, the Soviet Union was an ally of Great Britain and the United States in the war against Germany. But clearly he had both types in mind, both types of central planning. So from this memo, he writes up a short pamphlet called Freedom in the Economic System. He expands it a little bit and sorry, it was a magazine article first. Then he expands it into a pamphlet, adds a little bit, but then sits down to write The Road to Serfdom. And he's thinking big picture here, right? He says his concern is that we're abandoning the tradition, the individualist tradition, right? So individuals make decisions for themselves, coordinated through markets, all the stuff that he had written about in the socialist calculation debate about how markets work, which has created Western civilization. So this is not a small technical tract. A New York Times reviewer reads it and says, "This is a sad and angry little book." Well, that's two-thirds right. It is sad because of what's going on around him, as I was just describing, and it is angry. He's angry that people don't seem to realize that they're promoting a system that's going to produce horrible results, the opposite of what well-meaning people intend. So they need to understand that what they're calling for is not going to give them the results they wish for. It's going to give them results that follow from the logic of the system they're creating, not from wishful thinking. But it's not a little book, it's a great book, as the National Review later recognized, and as readers recognized. So, as I said, it was first published for a British audience, but it caused some controversy there. So some of Hayek's friends went, especially at the University of Chicago, went shopping for an American publisher, and they got the University of Chicago Press to bring it out. Commercial houses were not interested. Right? The big New York publishing houses were not interested. In the first year, the University of Chicago Press edition sold 40,000 copies, which is, I can tell you, it's unheard of for an academic book, or a book by an academic press, which is what the University of Chicago Press is. The Book of the Month Club snapped it up, put out a condensed version, sold 600,000 copies. But the thing that really put Hayek in the public eye was the Reader's Digest. Some of you of my age and older will remember the Reader's Digest. My parents got it every month. And incredibly, in 1945, the Reader's Digest had 7 million subscribers. 7 million subscribers. I don't think there's any magazine today that has 100,000 subscribers. But 7 million paper copies, and of course they were in every dentist's office and every doctor's office. Hayek's Road to Serfdom is condensed and made the lead article in the April 45 issue. And reprints are available. 1 million reprints are ordered. So we're talking big numbers here. And the University of Chicago Press over the years keeps selling copies. Here's a picture of the latest edition with a picture of a young-looking Hayek. And the latest edition is great because it has the memo to Beveridge, it has the earlier pamphlets, and it has a lot of sort of scholarly footnotes that say, here's how Hayek is implicitly attacking here if he doesn't name him. So the Reader's Digest edition appears while Hayek is on a boat crossing the Atlantic to come give some lectures in the US about the book. And the lectures have been scheduled for, universities where he might get 50 people in the audience. And he arrives in New York and he discovers that he's become a celebrity from the sensation that the Reader's Digest has caused. And he talked about this in an interview once, saying, imagine my surprise when they told me we were going to go to an auditorium with 3,000 people and there's a bank of microphones in front of me and a sea of expectant faces. So he goes across the country giving lectures to huge crowds. And he had never thought of it as a book that would have any appeal to Americans because it was mostly inspired by what was happening in Britain. But in the United States, there had been the New Deal, and the intellectual opponents of the New Deal had felt kind of defeated. And of course, Roosevelt was reelected 3 more times. 1944, Roosevelt had died, but it was the middle of what was his 4th term in office. So this was a rallying point for people who wanted to restore a freer market. So here's a table of contents of the book. I won't try to describe what's in each chapter. And I've taken some pictures from the cartoon version. So somebody is announcing a plan in the first one, and in the second picture, the different planners are fighting about what the plan ought to be, because you have to have priorities when you have a plan, and different representatives of business and labor and the government will have different interests, and so you have a fight. Putting a whip in one guy's hand was a little bit over the top maybe, but you can see the violence inherent in the system, to quote Monty Python. The chapters I would particularly want to highlight are the chapter on planning and the rule of law, because the rule of law was a concept that had really become kind of moribund. I'm happy to see that it's been rediscovered, even on the left, since Election Day. Right? The idea of having limits on what the executive can do without any authority other than his own say-so has been rediscovered. That's great. The chapter on whom is the idea I mentioned earlier, that it's not a question of plan or no plan, it's a question of a million plans, each person with his own plan or her own plan, coordinated through a price system that gives people signals about what other people want to buy, but doesn't tell anybody what they have to do with their property, versus a system in which somebody plans for everybody else, and then private use of property is definitely restricted, whether or not property titles are canceled. So in the Soviet Union, private property is just abolished, except in, the clothes on your back. Whereas in Nazi Germany, people are still nominally the owners of their factories, but they're getting a memo from the government saying, this is how much you produce, this is how many people you hire, and so on. All the important decisions are taken out of their hands. The chapter of why the worst get on top, so I'll come back to that one, but the idea is that despite the wishes of well-meaning people, when you concentrate power like this, the people who are going to take the reins of power are not going to be the most scrupulous people. As one reviewer put it, Hayek's argument amounts to saying that if you set up a slave plantation, the most tender-hearted person is not going to get the job of doing the whipping. Right? It's not how the system is going to select for. Somebody who's unscrupulous and ruthless is going to rise to the top in this kind of system where one will dominates all other wills. So that's here's the cartoon version. Somebody says all these different plans that are being tried at the same time, if they haven't been coordinated yet, leads to chaos. So there's a call for having a coherent plan, but a coherent plan means having somebody who decides which plan that is, and so the people fighting turn to a great leader who will implement the plan. So this is a sort of generic description of Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin. And liberty suffers because when you get to the point where people are told where they have to work, because if you choose your own job, how's that going to be consistent with having the right number of workers in each factory that's been made part of the plan? So this poor guy saying, I'm not a carpenter, I'm a plumber. Right, in a market economy, you can go be a plumber even if being a carpenter pays better. Then the market is kind of telling you we've got more plumbers than we need relative to carpenters, but you can still do it. But somebody who's got the highest cost of being a plumber, you might put it this way, somebody who's got the best alternatives is going to leave plumbing when the wages get too low, and it'll sort itself out. But in a planning system, it doesn't work that way. It can get down to the point where you're told what job to take. Now, a sort of interesting sidelight, one of the reviewers of The Road to Serfdom was Hayek's colleague from the LSE, a Fabian socialist named Evan Durbin. And Durbin says, well, but we in the Labor Party understand that liberty is a great thing, and we will never get to the point where we allocate labor. And because they were a Labor Party, right, they couldn't really say to workers, we're going to tell you where to work. Their membership, their rank and file wouldn't go for that. So he promised in his review that we in the Labor Party, in '44 they were out of power, but they were just about to come back in, we will never tell workers where they have to work. And when they came to power, they didn't. There's an internal battle within the Labor Party over just how far the plans are going to go, but the moderates win out over a group of economists who called themselves, only a little bit tongue-in-cheek, the Gosplaners. The Gosplan was the Soviet system of planning, and these people were calling themselves in London Gosplaners, as though it were, funny. Anyway, so maybe Hayek's book had some influence on Evan Durbin and thereby on labor policy, or maybe it was just that the workers who voted for them wouldn't want to be told where to work. And then the last cartoon is showing a picture of how propaganda becomes an important tool to motivate people when the price system is no longer motivating people. So in the socialist calculation debate, there are a lot of words on this. Let me summarize them. In the socialist calculation debate, Hayek had argued on economic terms why central planning isn't going to work in the sense of delivering prosperity. It's not going to coordinate activities as well as a market does, and it's not going to encourage the kind of discovery of better ways to do things. I mean, that's what drives the market process, as I imagine Professor Kersner said. It's the entrepreneur who drives the market process, discovering lower cost ways to produce things. In a centrally planned system, there's no room for new plans. We're trying to get a given set of plans to become coherent. We can't introduce new products. That just messes everything up. We can't introduce new methods of production that take less input. We've already allocated the input. Can't do that. So you don't get any technical progress under this kind of system. Anyway, it's not going to deliver the prosperity. In The Road to Serfdom, he's making a different point, but related, which is because the plan is not going to work, the planners have a choice, which is to give up the plan or to double their efforts at making the plan work. So if you can't get the mix of consumer goods right, stop producing so many consumer goods, and then people have to choose from among the few things that are available to them. And Hayek is warning that this centralization of power is dangerous. He says in a competitive system, nobody has the power to tell you what to buy. Nobody has the power to tell you where to work. Different businesses compete for your custom as a customer. They compete for your labor services as a worker. And so if you don't like one boss, you can find another boss. But in a centrally planned system, how's that going to work? And Hayek sees it as a real tragedy. So he's not questioning the motives of people who are advocating central planning. He calls it people of goodwill in Germany voted in the Nazi Party because they thought they would deliver prosperity. And so they thought the socialist policies would work, but the tragedy was they got results for civil liberties being crushed that they hadn't anticipated. So they got the opposite of what they wanted. And so it was a warning to Great Britain, let's not go down that road. You can't plan everything and still have individual liberty. Or the way Henry Hazlitt put it is, it's a warning to stop, look, and listen to well-intentioned and sincere planners and social democrats. And Hayek dedicates the book to socialists of all parties. And he was sincere about that. He wasn't mocking them. Some people on the left read that dedication and think it's mockery. But he's sincere. He's trying to convince them the policies you are advocating are not going to deliver the results you want. So stop, reconsider. I mentioned the chapter on the rule of law. So the rule of law is simply the concept that the political system ought to be governed by preset legal rules that are known in advance rather than by the arbitrary discretion of people in authority who can make stuff up as they go along. So kind of like the Federal Reserve does. But I'm slipping into my other line of thought. There should be a predetermined, set of rules that everybody has to live by. People can predict what the rules are. They know what's legal, what's not legal. So they can plan their businesses. They can plan their investments, their personal lives. They know what to do in order not to cross the line. But if you have a system of central planning, that's all out the window because the planners have to be able to adjust things however they like. They can't announce everything in advance and actually stick to it because the plan is typically incoherent. It has unintended consequences. It doesn't deliver what it promises. So they're going to make continual adjustments and tinkering, and they can't be pre-committed to any particular course of action. So central planning is inconsistent with the rule of law in that sense. Now, Hayek is not a libertarian at this stage in his career anyway. So he is providing intellectual ammunition to the opponents of the New Deal, the opponents of central planning. But he himself says, I'm not calling for a return to some mythical laissez-faire. He criticizes what he calls a wooden insistence on quote-unquote dogmatic laissez-faire. So he had his critics from the free market side who read The Road to Serfdom and said, well, this isn't nearly good enough for me, although it's better than, of course, what the planners are saying. But here's a list of the kind of government policies that are pretty far from laissez-faire or definite steps away from it, that Hayek says we can accommodate these we can accommodate them within a framework of the rule of law. And so these are not going to lead you down the road to serfdom, but it's a pretty extensive list. So he's not against a safety net, a social insurance system. And I think the important distinction here is planning involves policies that neutralize, or I should say disable, the price system. Right? Put quantitative controls on things. Don't let people choose by facing market prices and deciding how they want to allocate things. It disables the price system, so that doesn't do it anymore. And then goods have to be allocated by decree. But none of these policies does that. None of these disables the price system. So he's kind of describing the market economies you now have in Scandinavia. So large safety net, high taxes, but if you look at business policies, they're actually pretty business friendly. It's easier to establish a business. They score pretty high on the economic freedom indexes, actually. Very free trade economies, but yeah, high taxes and a big social safety net. And Hayek has a kind of pragmatic reason for this, which is if you make it too austere, nobody's going to vote for it. Gary Johnson, are you listening? No. I mean, I wish people would vote for it, but Hayek's view is if you tell people that no safety net, they're not going to vote for it. Most men will bear the risks that freedom entails only if the risks are not prohibitively great. So there has to be some reassurance to people that they won't be left destitute. That's his view. Now, some readers of the book, especially uncharitable readers of the book, have accused Hayek of believing that once you take the first step away from laissez-faire, you inevitably end up with full-blown communism. That's not what he says. He himself advocated, as I just showed, some steps away from laissez-faire, and he didn't think those would snowball. It is a kind of slippery slope argument, and parts of it derive from Mises' argument about the logic of interventionism. And Mises' example was, suppose you think that it would be nice to make milk more available to poor children. It's a nice goal. But then as a means for that, you choose, let's put a price control on milk so it'll be less expensive. Well, it's not actually going to make milk more available to poor children. It's going to cause a shortage of milk. Less milk is going to be produced at a price that's too low to clear the market. There are going to be lines for milk. You might have to ration milk. There's going to be less milk for everybody. So if you see that and say, oh, there wasn't as much milk produced, well, that's because milk producers can't make a profit, so we need to fix that. So now we need to control the cost that the farmers have. We need to put price controls on rural electricity, price controls on what are the inputs? Hay, cows, you're getting in, it's a little technical for me. But all the inputs into farming, We need to control their prices. Oh, but now we have shortages of those, so we need to control all the inputs into the production of those, and then it snowballs. So that's Mises' argument about the logic of interventionism. And Hayek pretty much picks that up. The trouble with partial planning is that it forces us to further steps, but here it's conditional. If, it's not inevitable, if the remaining free forces are not to upset our plans. So at any point, the planners can say, oh, it's not turning out how we expected, let's go back, the way Schock did. But Schock didn't keep his job. So having taken the steps, it's easier to go forward, not admit your mistakes, but try to double the efforts than it is to go back if you're a politician. But once you get to comprehensive central planning, then everything else sort of falls by the wayside. Free choice, and as I said earlier, the least scrupulous kind of people rise to the top of the system, so personal liberty is very much something that the rulers put to the side. It's not their concern. They're trying to get the plan to work. A famous economist named Paul Samuelson wrote the best-selling book in economics entitled Economics. In fact, I was talking about it with my dinner partner tonight. Samuelson took up Hayek's thesis in his principles text, which is kind of nice publicity, except that Samuelson made a complete hash of it. So this diagram is from his 1964 paper that preceded his actually putting it in the textbook, but it's the same diagram basically. So he interprets the road to serfdom as Great Britain went from a period of high political freedom and high economic freedom, those are the two axes, and is plunging towards serfdom, which is low political freedom and low economic freedom. But look where he's got fascism. According to Samuelson, fascism is a system of high economic freedom. What does he think a fascist economic policy is? He seems to think, like Beveridge did, that it's some kind of laissez-faire policy. It's just completely wrong. Fascism belongs where the serfdom box is. Fascism is a kind of serfdom. And then Samuelson provides some empirical evidence in the second diagram where he counts, say, Norway 1950 as a country with very low economic freedom because it's got high taxes and a large social safety net. But that's not what Hayek's talking about. He's talking about economic freedom in the way that impinges on the choices people are able to make with their own property, rule of law, price system, and so on. At one point he put, on the second diagram, he put Germany 1938, where he's got the fascism box on the left-hand diagram. So completely fanciful reading of what Hayek's message was. All right, so according to Samuelson, the trend goes the other way. There's a trade-off between economic and political freedom. It's not that less of one means less of the other. So that's the kind of abuse Hayek's thesis suffered at the hands of unsympathetic interpreters. Let me wrap up with this interpretation, do I want to call it? This response to Hayek. And so this is from John Maynard Keynes, who I quoted earlier saying great things about the Webb's book about the Soviet Union. Keynes is on a boat in 1944 heading across the Atlantic. He's going to Bretton Woods, where he's going to help design the world's monetary system, along with the American Treasury agent Harry Dexter White, no relation. So they're going to plan, and out of the Bretton Woods Conference, of course, comes the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So Keynes is on a meeting of top-level economic planners to plan the world's monetary system, and he writes a letter from the boat to Hayek saying, "It's a grand book. I find myself in agreement with virtually the whole of it." Not only in agreement, but in deeply moved agreement. And this part of Keynes' statement is often quoted as though Hayek's book was so persuasive it even persuaded Keynes. Yeah, you got to keep reading. You got to wait for the but. But What we want is not no planning or even less planning. We almost certainly want more. But it's not going to be the danger that you, Hayek, think, because we're going to staff the planning bureaus with good people, with experts, with Keynes's buddies from Cambridge, right? If the people carrying it out are rightly orientated in their own minds and hearts to your moral position. So as long as we have classical liberals doing the planning, everything will turn out great. It's almost as though Keynes skipped the chapter on why the worst get on top. Okay, I'd better stop there and take questions. Thanks very much.
We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and the microphone will be brought to you.
How do you think the chapter on people turning to, quote, great leaders and how the worst get on top applies to the modern political environment in the United States?
Let me skip to my last slide. Oops. Darn it. Well, my last slide was Venezuela. So in the United States, is this a question about the election? I would say neither party, neither major party, spoke to the concerns Hayek raised, in the sense that neither party said we need to scale dramatically back on government's role in deciding the allocation of resources. So Hillary had no problem with Obamacare. Trump had a little bit of a problem. He was going to repeal it and replace it with something better, but keep all the good parts. So that seems to me like a kind of wishful thinking, that you can have all the good parts without all the unintended consequences of subsidies and price controls and direct allocations. So nobody's advocating central planning. Nobody advocates in the modern era doing away with the market. So I think we've made some progress in that respect. But they still talk about planning one industry at a time. Healthcare is a pretty big industry. Without recognizing that the logic doesn't stop there. It's hard to confine it to a single industry, because people are going to find ways around the controls, and then you need to block those, and then you've got more spillover effects and so on. But you asked specifically about a great leader. I don't know if I want to try to guess what exactly people who voted for Trump were voting for. I think some were perhaps inspired by the idea that he's a guy who can get things done. Right? He wasn't promising central planning, though, but he did say these are problems that only I can fix. So there were a lot of reasons people might have voted for Trump. That might have been one of them. The main one, of course, was he wasn't Hillary Clinton. So we'd have to consult an exit poll, and those are always reliable.
We have time for one more question.
You mentioned the immense popularity of the road to serfdom among especially the public. Was there any kind of coordinated political or social response in terms of, elections afterwards, or anything that the public did in response to reading his work?
So in Great Britain, Winston Churchill in the 1945 elections after the war actually quoted from The Road to Serfdom and said, the Labour Party wants planning, and that means they're going to have a Gestapo. And that was regarded as a little bit rhetorically crude, a little bit too harsh. And his opponent, Clement Attlee, the next day issued a press release saying, Winston Churchill is quoting the ideas of this Austrian professor, Friedrich August von Hayek. He used his middle name, I guess, to make him sound more foreign, who is right now supplying ideas to the Conservative Party. So Attlee was elected in a fairly large landslide, actually, so the message didn't go over there. If you look at the reviews in the sort of mainstream press, it's almost as though there was an organized effort to attack and undermine the book. But there was organized promotion of the book by Reader's Digest, by General Motors that made the condensed version available, by the people who did the cartoon version, by the Foundation for Economic Education, which was the one free market think tank around in those days. So there are efforts on both sides. But the opponents pretty much tended to caricature it, like Paul Samuelson did, although there have been exceptions. One of the slides I didn't get to has the sort of left-leaning economist, I would say, Indian economist, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, on the 60th anniversary of the Road to Serfdom, had a very nice appreciation of it. And of course, India went through its own period of a kind of tyranny under a democratically elected government that declared an emergency and shut down all the usual protections of civil liberty. But they were in the middle of a system of 5-year plans. So the government had the resources, the tools, the levers to shut down their opponents. But anyway, Sen says, what Hayek warns us about is the psychology that accompanies a concentration of power, because those who are wielding the power who are aiming at certain goals, giving them sort of top priority, are going to regard concerns about rule of law, civil liberty, those kind of niceties as just so much sand that's going to gum up the works, and they will tend to disregard it. So we have to be on the watch for that.
Thank you, Dr. White.